Okay, welcome to the first seminar in a series of seminars organized by the Macroeconomic Modeling and Model Comparison Network. That's an initiative run under the auspices of CEPR and jointly by Goethe University in Frankfurt, the Institute for Monetary and Financial Stability, and Stanford University, the Hoover Institution. And we're delighted to have Harald Uhlig from Chicago starting us off today on macroeconomic dynamics and reallocation in a pandemic. Before handing over to Harald, let me just hand over to our co-host, John Taylor, who's going to say a few words about this series and also give a greeting. John.
Thank you, Volker. Thank you, Harald, for being here to lead us off. It's terrific. The overall purpose is to see how econometric models more generally are can be adapted in different ways to this terrible pandemic we have. And this is a terrific way to start. We're going to have a series of twice a week to start, and then maybe go to once a week. There's so much work going on, and it's just impressive. When you read this paper, which Harald will be discussing, it's just remarkable how rapidly it was put together and how informative it is. So welcome, Harald, and thank you, Volker, and let's get started.
Let me add one thing in terms of questions and answers. Harald will speak for about half an hour, 40 minutes, and then we have Q&A, and you can use the Q&A tool in Zoom, and one of us, or Mr. Learman, who's the technical host, will read the questions so that Harald then can give the answers. So Harald, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Volker. Thanks, John, for allowing me to do this. I mean, this is great. And yeah, it's you know, I think many of us, you know, once this hit started, you know, going to the drawing board and trying to write papers, you know, quickly or thinking about the topic. And, you know, it's all, you know, in some ways very quick work, which was good, but it's also maybe, you know, some of the things eventually maybe need to be thought out in greater detail. So this, you know, think of this as a contribution to the debate rather than the final word, that's for sure. It's joint work with Dirk Krueger, who was at the University of Pennsylvania, and Taojun Xie, who was at the National University of Singapore. They may be listening too, and we'll see. So it's the title of the paper, Macroeconomic Dynamics and Reallocation in a Pandemic. And what we're going after is really this question, right? We are now getting to this reopening debate. Should one reopen? And governments are, you know, quite nervous about this because they think, well, if you reopen, you know, maybe people will be, you know, irresponsible, and you know, and we'll be back and get another wave of the disease, and you know, that's possible, right? There are lots of ways of thinking about this. But we've also seen countries like Sweden, which haven't really imposed too much on their own population in what they do. I mean, they gave them advice, but you know, largely left it to people's own responsible devices to do the right thing. And indeed, you know, from an economist's perspective, you always have to ask yourself, how much would you do on your own? How much would people do on their own, you know, facing up to the possibility of catching infection? I mean, it's clear that there's an externality, right? If I get infected, I might not take into account that infects others, right? If I'm taking you know, the typical economist selfish perspective, which is going to be the baseline that we ought to take here. But still, people are also not lemmings that in the face of danger, in face of getting infected, will run to the cliff and jump off, like in the mythical lemming story. You know, they will change their consumption behavioral pattern. And so we wanted to see how much will people do on their own. So think of this as a version of this Swedish story, perhaps, if you want, but obviously it's not going to model the Sweden in detail for sure. So the starting point, what we do here is we build on a paper by Eigenbaum, Rebello, and Trabant. And I hear that Matthias is going to present on Wednesday. And maybe they're presenting the paper on which we're building here. So in some ways, that will be the reverse sequence. So in that sense, our paper is, this presentation is going to be advertisement for their work. They've meanwhile written a follow-up paper to the original paper. So maybe Matthias is presenting that one, and I'll leave this to Matthias to sort this out on Wednesday. Anyway, so what's the model? Like them, we're looking at a neoclassical growth model, very simple, as you're going to see. And we put in this infamous CEPR model, right? The model in which you have susceptible, infected, and recovered agents, and there's some disease dynamics. And like Eigenbaum, Ribelle, and Trabant, we assume that infection happens when people consume. Actually, they also consider, that infection happens when agents work and when they interact socially. We also allow for the latter part. As far as the work part is concerned, here we just wanted to show the mechanism, so we left that out. And we show in the paper, and we could go into the details if people want, that that there's a formulation of this work infection that's equivalent to the model that I'm showing here. And in other cases, results are quite similar. So I think it's probably fine to concentrate on the consumption. Now, the key difference to them is that we think that heterogeneous consumption sectors differ infection risks. So what we are thinking about here is what we have seen before actually the lockdown happened. You saw that reservations at restaurants declined, and instead people started to consume at home. Right? You don't go to the pizza restaurant; you get pizza delivered at home. We've seen this at universities, at schools, that people teach from home. They don't teach from they don't teach in the classroom. So that's also a form of consumption, if you like, for the students. And if you're at home, you're less likely to be infected. So that's what we wanted to model. And susceptible agents that could get infected make a conscious decision. They shift their consumption. I mean, they might lower their consumption overall. That's a key mechanism, Eigenbaum, Ribelle, and Trabant, in light of this danger. But they will also shift consumption towards these low infection sectors. They will do things on their own to try to minimize their own infection risk. It's a stylized model. Question is, what's appropriate parameterization? I should be very frank. I'm going to show you two parameters on which much of the quantitative results rest, and these two parameters we just make up. We thought about, is there some way of tying them to data, but data is coming on in a very incomplete manner. So this is more to demonstrate the mechanism, and then we can debate the parameters all day long if you like to. Okay, so for the parameters that we like, but I mean, again, it's debatable. I'm going to show you some robustness analysis. But if you take these parameters, then the output decline in the infection rates are going to be reduced by 80% to what would happen in the marginal sector economy on its own. So the fact that there are these choices now considerably dampens the effect both on the output decline and the infection rates. Okay, so now maybe that's too panglossy in the story, but I think it's an important element in the story, and and it tells some important messages, some important lessons about the economy. Okay, so let me get into this. So here's the model part. If you're alive, then you enjoy consumption from from consuming C, and you have this utility from working N, and you discount, I mean, maybe there should be an expectation in utility function. You discount, you take the net present value of the utility function there. And there's a utility function. The utility function has log consumption and quadratic with utility and labor. And but in difference, so this is also what Eigenbaum, Ribelle, and Trabant assume. In difference to them, you now allow this consumption to be bundled. So it's a bundle of individual consumption goods across, a continuum of sectors. So I think this integral here should be going really from 0 to 1. So let's imagine there's a continuum. Although in the end, you're just going to, focus essentially really on, two sector version of this, as you're going to see. Okay, now critical parameter is going to be this elasticity of substitution eta here, and that's going to play a key role. That's one of the parameters that's going to play a key role in our analysis later on. But that's where the choice can happen. Dead agents receive utility of 0, so that's a bit of a normalization if you think about it here. Production and labor markets, we make them very frictionless, and that's maybe also an assumption that can be debated at great lengths. It's competitive, linear, and frictionless, and 1 unit of labor produces a unit of any good. So the budget constraint for an agent is all agents work here if they're alive, even infected agents. They just produce, these various consumption varieties, and it's linear production function. So that's in 2, and 2 is also then the budget constraints. And then overall market's clear. Okay, so that's macro. Now we get to the SIR part, right? So agents can be susceptible, infected, recovered, or dead. And their population fractions, ST, IT, RT, in terms of the initial population. The infection is transmitted while consuming, or perhaps also autonomously. The autonomously, we put that in there as a robustness check. And their overall contagion parameters, pi-s and pi-a, that are going to be critical. I'm going to tell you what we did with that. So the new thing is that we have the variety-specific relative contagiousness. So depending on the variety that you consume, the goods, that consumption, that social interaction that you do when you do consuming has different impact on your contagion. So the key equation is this one here. What's the probability for susceptible agents to become infected? It depends on this overall parameter pi-s. It depends on the number of infected people. So that's, this first part here, if you like, is standard SIR modeling. But then it also depends on how much you consume in a particular sector and how much the infected agents consume in that sector, and this contagiousness factor there. So if this contagiousness factor is 0, for example, that wouldn't result in any infection on your part as a susceptible person. So this is what you choose, right? The consumption of when you're susceptible, that's what you choose, whereas what infected agents choose, that's what you have to take as given. I mean, you see them out there, you're seeing them milling about, and you're saying, should I consume that sector or not? Then presumably you're going to choose sectors that have a lower phi-k. So that's the idea. Now we also allow for infection to happen autonomously. I mean, you could argue that in some ways everything is consumption, maybe not measured in national income product accounts, but even if I go for a walk or something, right? I mean, you could take a walk in your garden or take a walk in a crowded area, and then it's consumption again. So in some ways, maybe we shouldn't even have this by A, and it's all the first part. But that's we put that in this robustness check. Okay, and then the rest is just the same as in any of these SIR models. So if TT is the fraction of the population of the newly infected, that's the probability of becoming infected for a susceptible person times the total fraction of the population that is susceptible. And then you subtract that from the susceptible agents, you add that to the infected agents. From the infected agents, you also have to subtract those that die or recover, that's here. And then the recovered is just marching forward by the recovered agents. The dead people here disappear from the population. All right, so that's the model. So now let's go into the analysis. So for the infected and the recovered agents, it's very simple. They don't. It's a static problem for them really. So they don't take into account. I mean, they don't care which sector they consume. They're indifferent between the sectors. And so you just solve this, and here's a solution. They just work a certain constant amount, and they consume a certain constant amount, and that's it. I mean, note here that we're assuming that the infected know that the infected, and the recovered know that the recovered. I mean, that's that's a choice, and that's a choice that we made. Now, now we have to think about the choice of susceptible agents and recall the infection constraint, right? So this was this equation that I put in a box before, right? That's the same equation here. And we know now the solution for the infected agents, right? We know that infected agents are going to consume this A over square root theta. So that's what the susceptible agents have to take into account when they choose their own consumption here, right, in the particular sector. And to do that, they're thinking about this Bellman equation that's coming next. So they're thinking about their own value now, which is the current, current utility, plus these transitions, which now depend on these infection probabilities that show up here. So with some probably 1 minus tau t that you have an influence on, you stay suspected, but with the probability tau t, you become infected, and then once you're infected, there's some exogenous probability that makes you where you die, right? And so that's what you're trying to avoid. Okay, so then we get a first order condition that you can characterize, and the first order condition with respect to consumption has the usual Lagrange multiplier on the budget constraint, but it has this additional Lagrange multiplier here on this tau t constraint up here. So there's an additional cost in essence, of consuming a particular, of consuming, and that's coming because you're risking infection, right? So that's a problem. But the cost differs by sector, and so the phi k enters here. So the cost is smaller the smaller the phi k is, and that's sort of how you might want to read that equation. All right, and so then you put it all together. You put market clearing in there, and then you can analyze the model. We have a few theoretical results, thinking through what happens if eta is equal to 0, or what happens if eta is equal to infinity. But rather than going through all of them, I mean, they're interesting, they give you limiting results. Let me instead show you numerically what comes out in a couple of graphs. So for the numerical results, we choose parameters that are similar to Eigenbaum, Ribello, and Trabant. In our baseline scenario, we set this autonomous infection rate to 0. Again, the argument here is that everything is consumption, even if you take a walk. So then maybe pi a equal to 0 is a good starting point. And Eigenbaum, Ribello, and Trabant have done a very careful calibration. They thought hard about what might happen and so forth, and drawn various sources. And they argued in a version of this model where you had homogeneous sectors that eventually going to see a decline in consumption, which is the same as a decline in output of finally 10%, right? And the 10% consumption decline comes because susceptible agents realize there are a lot of infected agents out there. So they hold back on consumption. They realize that by consuming, they might get infected, and that generates the output decline all on its own, without the government doing a shutdown, without anything else. Okay. So we are so we adjust pi s in such a way to also get this 10% decline that they have. We just take that as input into our analysis. We just want to compare our results to their results effectively and seeing how much this heterogeneity mitigates the effect that they document. So so we're going to have two equally sized sectors. The size of the sectors, actually we looked into this, doesn't really matter that much, but you can think that the first 50% of the sectors have a phi of k that's equal to this phi 1, which is 0.2. And the other half of the sectors have a phi 2 that's 1.8. So on average, they average out to 1. So on average, it looks like the homogeneous case where phi is constant at 1. But now, if you eat pizza at home, whereas in a restaurant, eating it in a restaurant is 9 times as infectious as if you eat it at home. So that factor, that ratio between phi 2 and phi 1, that's a critical input into our analysis. We're trying out other various versions for phi 1, and then phi 2 is always 2 minus phi 1. And it's a number, I wish I could, look at. I mean, we have some evidence made for restaurants, but if you think about the economy as a whole, those numbers would be super hard to really tie down this data. So think of this more as a way of demonstrating the effects, and then you can take your own judgment to see how important this may be. And likewise, the elasticity of substitution is going to matter a lot, right? So if the elasticity of substitution is high, it's easier to substitute in this low phi 1 sector, but if the elasticity of substitution is low, then presumably you cannot. If you think of pizza, probably eating pizza at home, pizza in a restaurant, the elasticity of substitution is very high. The trade literature and some other literatures suggest that for varieties that are close in what they deliver, an elasticity of substitution of 10 might be appropriate. So that's going to be our baseline scenario. But we're also trying eta equals 3, so that's probably appropriate for varieties that are a little further apart. We can think of certain consumptions that where say now let's taking a vacation versus watching TV at home or something. Maybe the elasticity of substitution there is 3 rather than 10. But it's a crucial parameter. Also, once you think about a version of this model where we have infection in the labor market rather than by social consumption, it's the mechanics of the model is very much the same. And actually, there's one way of writing it down where the mechanics is exactly the same, but then the interpretation of the promise is different, right? And we know that for some of us, it's easy to substitute towards work at home. So for academics like me, maybe eta equals 10 is appropriate. But if you work in a meat packing plant or something else, that's probably not the case. And maybe want to even have heterogeneity in the eta. but then maybe lower parameter for eta is relevant. Anyway, so we're having some variations here. We also allow pi a, because as you're going to see, without this pi a, we don't get quite the disease dynamics that Eichenbaum, Rebel, and Trabant got. Maybe that's a good thing because we don't see, you know, they calibrated it to initial statements, initial fears. I believe that Merkel mentioned in how far this goes in, I don't know, the hundreds and thousands of deaths that we would see in Germany, and certainly far from that, even in the most disastrous areas. So maybe that's all right. But if you put in pi a bigger than 0, then you get a big disease dynamics and some variations. Okay, so let me show you some results. Here are the parameters. The parameters are not particularly interesting. The one thing that perhaps I should mention, though, is this parameter A plays a somewhat critical role, since adjusting A is about how much utility you get when you're alive, and therefore in some ways has something to do with measuring the distance between you wanting to be alive versus you fearing of being dead. And if you raise A, then death is particularly daunting. But if you lower A, actually, if you lower A too much, you might even get to a point where people prefer to be dead because otherwise you would have negative utility. But that would seem like an absurd implication of the model. All right, so here's our baseline picture. So the graph that I want to emphasize is the blue one. So that's the baseline. So that's for, you know, eta equals 10, and this phi1 equals to 0.2 parameterization that are advertised. And you're seeing that, you know, there's weeks down here on the axis. Maybe you know, if looking at this picture more and more, I think now maybe, you know, I don't know, but it feels like a very slow dynamics. Maybe this is all unfolding more quickly, but who knows? I mean, this is all so much in flux. Hard to say. So you're seeing that if you allow people this possibility for consumption shift, they are shifting away, right? They're shifting away from eating pizza in restaurants to pizza at home, from you know, ordering, from going to store and buying things at you know, Macy's versus ordering things from Amazon and that sort of thing. And so overall, you know, it's not the same thing, right? So aggregate consumption does decline because it's still infectious to maybe do this joint consumption here, but consumption declines, you know, by now somewhere between 1% and 2% at the peak, compared to the minus 10%. Remember, the minus 10% is what we just took from Eichenbaum, Rivera, and Trabant, that you would get from the homogeneous economy. So the minus 10% is hardwired into this model, you know, taking Eichenbaum, Rivera, and Trabant as a baseline case. But here now we're getting much less because of this possibility for the consumption shift. Now, if the elasticity of substitution is not 10, but it's 3, then obviously the, you know, people don't like substituting quite as much. And here's a consumption decline that you get there. It's now maybe minus 4% rather than minus 1.5%. But you can also get the other side. If pi s, this infection probability, gets mitigated a little bit more due to social distancing. In fact, we find that if you set it to 87% of the value that we use for the other simulations, then you get that consumption is at its steepest initially and then rises, because what you're getting is that this much talked about replication rate sinks below 1, and the disease dynamics kind of stops on its own in that case. so basically the sectoral shift plus some social distancing could lead to, you know, with perfectly functioning labor markets, I should mention, could lead to this disease, you know, dying out all on its own. So you might ask, okay, well, that's, you know, this phi1 parameter, as I mentioned, we kind of made it up. And so I think this is informative. You could look at this consumption decline if you look at various values for phi1, and here they are, right? Obviously, phi1 is 1, then phi2 is also equal to 1. Phi2, as I mentioned, is always, you know, 1 minus phi1, and then you can calculate that ratio. So we always want an average phi1 to be comparable in that sense. If we didn't do the consumption shift, you know, you would always get back to the homogeneous case. And here's what you see, right? Our 0.2 example is down there, and you're seeing, you know, I mean, the effect kicks in pretty quickly, right? I mean, you're halving the effect already at, I don't know, phi1 equals 0.5, so that's a factor of 1 to 3 from phi2 to one. All right. And likewise for the death dynamics. So let me look at that maybe depending on who you ask, right? I think medics always think that that's probably more important than really the economic dynamics. If you look at the numbers of people that die, right? You can compare that to the. You can look at the numbers themselves. I'm going to show you the dynamics of that too. But you can also do the comparison to one of the scenarios. So here we have chosen. Actually, this should probably be the homogeneous case here. You could choose the phi one equal to 1 case as our baseline scenario. So that would be 100% up here. And then ask, how many of these deaths that you would get in the homogeneous, no lockdown economy will be avoided by having the sectoral shift opportunity. And that's what you're getting down here, right? You're seeing that you're getting only 20% of the deaths that would otherwise happen in this homogeneous sector economy. So the whole point here is to say that the possibility for people to shift to sectors that are less infectious on their own can lead to considerable mitigation of the infection risk. The government doesn't have to take people by the hand all the time and tell them, look, it's dangerous out there. Don't go out. If it's dangerous out there, people will think about that risk. You still have to live, right? So you have to encounter some of that danger. It can't be avoided, but you're making the appropriate choices and going to be careful as a result. This is the same comparison here, but here we chose as a baseline our 0.2 scenario. So it's the same ratios, but flip on its head if you like. Okay, so this is the overall dynamics. Sorry. We didn't have the lower pi s in this picture here, and maybe you should have. But anyway, so you're seeing our baseline, the consumption dynamics. Consumption dynamics, that's a picture that I showed before. It's just declining to between around -1% compared to the -10% that you get in the homogeneous sector case. And down here, that's the economic dynamics. Labor and consumption is almost the same thing. So there isn't much difference. And the rest is the SIR dynamics, right? You're seeing the infected, the susceptible, and the recovered, and the deceased. And again, you're gonna get people dying, right? So there's no, there's no avoiding that here. If you let people make their own choices, there are externalities for sure, right? But it's much less than if you just think about the homogeneous dynamics here, and you get rates of maybe 5% of the 0.05% of the initial population. So that's modest. Now, if you throw in this possibility that people get infected on their own, then you can get infection rates of up to 50% of the population eventually, and deceased people, might be 0.1% of the population, and the difference is now much smaller because now the consumption substitution possibility is still helping, but obviously it's not helping that much because if the infected people out there with this autonomous infection, you're getting infected when you're susceptible, no matter how much you consume. But still, we get some mitigation. So it's interesting for us to see that you still get mitigation here. So here we chose a pi a in order to get this to get the number of infected there, as in Eigenbaum, Rubella, Trabant, right? So okay, and likewise, you don't get the mitigation in terms of the deceased, right? Remember, this was a case that I showed before, compared to the baseline result of 100% here in the marginal sector case. And for eta equals 10, right, you're getting 20% on here. But there's a autonomous infection, it's not quite as good. And of course, if eta is equals 3, then and you have autonomous infection, you're getting closer and closer back to the original scenario. Now, we can vary eta, we can vary the elasticity of substitution. In fact, if you make the elasticity of substitution very high, if you make it 100 or even 1,000, then people substitute into these other sectors so much that the disease dynamics dies out on its own. The R is more than 1. That's maybe 2 panglossium, but just showing where things go. And you also get this reversal that I mentioned. If pi s is just 80%, 87% of the regional value, right? You're seeing that the replication rate in that case is more than 1, and you're seeing that the number of infected keeps steadily declining over time, and the disease dies out on its own. Notice that we started initially with 0.1% of the population being infected. Yes, that's also somewhat crucial for these simulations. Now, the important message here really is about this sectorial shift, right? So here I show this for the baseline, also true in other elastic substitution. We have a low infection sector, we have a high infection sector. So if you just look at the case where phi1 is 1 and phi2 is, phi1, so here we have phi1, sorry, not 1, but phi1 equals 0.2 and phi2, the baseline calibration, 1.8. What you're seeing here is that in the high infection sector, there's a dramatic decline in how much people work there, right? We're seeing these employment losses there, and they are, even in the baseline scenario, they're probably much in line with what we're seeing now, right? And here we're seeing 20, 25%, 30% of unemployment, if you like, in these people that lose jobs in these high infection sectors. So that's happening. We're seeing that, right? I mean, the unemployment rates now in the United States are higher than they've ever been, since they started counting, since essentially the Second World War. So yes, that is happening. And there's a lot of hand-wringing about this, right? People lose jobs in the airline industry. People lose jobs in restaurants. People lose jobs in the, I don't know, in all kinds of social activities. But the point that the model is making is other sectors are rising, right? Other sectors rise and need workers, right? So it's still the case that there's an employment decline overall, but there's a substitution from some sectors into other sectors. So Amazon is looking for workers, right? You need more delivery people. You need more people that service online. Zoom is booming, I hear, right? I hear that in Illinois they're still trying to hire contract tracers to find people that trace people. So there are sectors that are in high demand now that are looking for people to employ. And what the model is saying is that really we should let that rip. We should have workers reallocating from these high infection sectors to these low infection sectors as much as possible, because there are sectors that have demand for workers. There are other sectors where we see decline in employment. And if you allow these labor markets to function as smoothly as possible, then maybe that can mitigate the overall decline in employment. Now, if you don't do that, obviously, if you don't shift people into the low infection sectors, then you're only seeing the employment decline in the high infection sectors. You can also look at this, across many sectors here. So that's a picture if in a 9-sector version of this model. So now we have 9 sectors with different phi1s here. So they all average out to 1 eventually. And you're seeing this, effectively this employment decline, right, in the high infection sectors, but you're seeing this employment rise, or in the low infection sectors. In fact, there's a bit of a nonlinearity, as you can tell, right? The highest increase is in the very low infection sectors. So the distance here, is maybe more than the distance over here. And that's just to say that people really, really try to get into the lowest infection sectors and try to go away from the high infection sectors. But it's the sectoral shift that we have to think about in this time of crisis. We have to anything that we can do to make that happen will alleviate the employment losses and will also alleviate the disease dynamics ultimately. So it's a good thing on both sides. Now, did this happen? It's not we don't have any empirical evidence here in a serious manner. This was a graph that the New York Times had published mid-April, and we have also seen this from open table reservations and so forth, right? So this year's March 19th, the day that California issued the country's first stay-at-home order. But you're already seeing, you're already seeing sort of an acceleration in some sense of the sectoral shifts here, in the run-up to this. So it's already the case that, before the government told people can't do any of these things anymore, people already started not to go to restaurants, not to travel, they stocked up on groceries. We know that, right? And so all this shifting was already going on without the government holding their hands and telling them to do that. And it's natural, right? You don't want to go out and get infected. It's maybe all there. And here's another way of looking at this, right? So this was also for the week ending April 1st. Now this conflates both what's coming from government action and what's coming from what people do on their own. But you're seeing, right? I mean, unsurprisingly, right? Movie theaters, airlines, that's all declining, and that's the bad news, right? But the good news is that there are other things where the economy is booming. Online grocers in particular is booming, right? Food delivery is booming. And depending on your view, maybe it's good or bad news that alcohol is also booming, right? So we can talk about this. All right. Now, we can think about the social planner solution, and I just put it on the table, to just make sure not to be misunderstood. Here, the infected people know who they are, so we want to put the social planner on the same footing, so the social planner knows who they are. The social planner can't completely quarantine the infected. The social planner has to feed the infected, and when the infected consume, they prevent infection risk to the susceptible agents. But the social planner can, of course, go much further than the decentralized economy, because it's taken into account this externality, right? If you're susceptible and you get infected, you don't take into account in our selfish economic model here that increases infection risk for other infected people. So, the social planner here can do wondrous things, right? And you're seeing, right, if you look at the consumption dynamics, for example, here, right, the consumption dynamics is flat. There's no decline in aggregate consumption practically, even compared to our, decentralized solution where you have this sectorial shift. There are no, deceased people don't happen, but that's really because the social planner knows who the infected are, right? Think of this as widespread testing, or that they can really appeal to people. We now know that even, that often people that are infected don't even show any symptoms. So that's surely way to Panglossium. It's just to put something out there. And how does the social planner do that? Well, the social planner can only do this by shifting consumption, and he does it by telling the infected people don't consume very little, right? Then you present a low infection risk. But it's a little better than in the constant fee in the homogeneous case, right? So in the homogeneous case, the infected get to consume very, very little. But now, because we have the sectoral substitution possibility, the social planner doesn't have to be quite as draconian on the infected people. And that's because, if they consume in the low infection sector, they don't present quite as much of a risk for the susceptible people, and they don't have to lower the consumption quite as much there. So it's okay for infected people to eat pizza at home. For me to eat pizza at home, we presumably don't infect each other very much when we do that. So that's the idea. Assuming that I'm susceptible and not infected, right? So that's a bit of information. Yeah. All right. So let me close the presentation at this point, because hopefully there will be some questions and some debate. But just to recap, right? I mean, we are entering this reopening debate. We are looking at Sweden. Sweden. I mean, there are a lot of people dead. If you look per capita, it's not looking that great, right? I don't want to, so that one can have a serious debate about this. But it also looks like Sweden, the curve is flattening. The consumption decline, the overall economy decline is not quite as steep, and so maybe Sweden is teaching all us as a lesson how it's going to look like when we reopen. And I think what we learned from Sweden, what we've learned from this model, is that people will do things on their own to avoid these infection risks. We've looked at that in the neoclassical model, where we put in this infection risk in there using the standard SIR model, where people have the possibility to go to good varieties that are lower in the infection risk. And then for the parameter choices that we picked, and arguably, they are a little arbitrary, you get that the output decline infection rates get to be reduced by 80% compared to the margin sector version. You can even get a flattening of the curve rather than a reversal of the curve. Okay, so this is, this working with a very smooth labor market. It's maybe too optimistic as a story, perhaps. But I think in this day and age, you know, some optimism is welcome, I hope. All right, that's it.
Well, thank you very much, Harald, for the very clear presentation. It's great. Maybe as I just want to point out again to everyone, we have a lot of participants. So there is the FNA tool. You can enter the questions and you can vote on the questions. So there are already some questions. Somebody asked about slides and paper. The paper is available with a link, and slides will be available after on the website. Now, as people still enter, let me throw in a quick question on my part, a two-folded question. One is, you look at everything from the consumption side and the consumption choice. Does it mean you think it's automatically takes care of the production side? Because in practice, we've seen limits on production, border closings, so airlines could not fly across borders, and even companies in certain sectors having to close. And second, so what about getting at this from the production side and the health risks, which already happen in the context of production? And secondly, there seems to be little room for government or no government choices. So where would you take this to bring in government choices such as stimulus or such as loans to companies to weather this and inform governments on what best to choose?
Yeah, thank you. So that's you know, that's there are a lot of questions in there, and I can answer some of them. I can't answer all of them for sure. It's true that we chose you know, I mean, Eichenbaum, Ribello, and Trabant, again, you know, they're both the consumption interaction, the labor interaction, and since, you know, we set out to, you know, we wanted to have this substitution possibility, but also aimed at understanding the mechanism mainly, rather than, you know, I mean, you know, I mean, I guess we could have also understood the mechanism if we had both, but you know, we decided to make our life easier, let's just start with one. And in retrospect, maybe the labor interaction would have been more reasonable than the consumption interaction, because I do think that maybe where the infection happens is really on the labor side rather than the consumption side. But we chose the consumption side, and two things on that though. The one thing on the consumption side, it's kind of, you know, we all agree that sort of this constant elasticity of substitution, you know, formulation that we have here is a way to go on the consumption side. And on the labor side, there's a way of formulating the model also with some substitution, so that mechanically, formally, the model boils down to the exact same, we get the exact same formulas, you get the exact same dynamics with the exact same parameters. So in the appendix of our paper, of the most recent version, we have a formula equivalence result. But it turns out that on the labor side, there are several ways of formulating that, and some of them turn out not to be equivalent, and then you get slightly different dynamics from minutiae in the formulation of the labor interaction. So the way I want to understand this paper is, if you think that's really all on the labor side rather than the consumption side, you know, that's fine. The results, you know, the pictures that I showed remain the same, right? It's just that the decline happens because people fear the interaction on the labor side rather than the consumption side. And then it's just a debate on the elasticity of substitution either. Now, I think the more interesting question is, and it has been raised in some of the papers out there, that in certain sectors it's easier to substitute than other sectors, and that's not something that we have, right? I mean, here it's all it's just one big economy, and that certainly would be interesting to pursue. Now, as far as government is concerned, I mean, again, Eichenbaum, Ribello, and Trabant actually consider that. Here we only went to the social planner solution, right? And of course, once you have the social planner solution, you can think about how would you implement that social planner solution, maybe with taxes and so forth. You can think about this. Eichenbaum, Ribello, and Trabant do something more modest by saying, let's just have the government, you know, impose something affecting everybody equally. And so now here's the thing that you want to do. If you look at this model, the infection risk happens via joint consumption, right? So, and the social planner realizes that people don't take into account that susceptibility might infect others. They're consuming too much, right? In the decentralized economy, people consume too much. The infected people certainly, but also the susceptible people consume too much, and that creates a problem. So what does a government want to do? the government wants to reduce consumption. How do you reduce consumption? Taxing people, right? So it turns out that in this model, taxing consumption is actually a good thing to do, because you could essentially internalize the wedges between the social planner solution and the private sector solution. So so it's a little weird, right? I mean, you have a decline of the economy, and of course, the first inclination that we all have is, you know, lower taxes, but maybe raising taxes on consumption is the right way to go here, if that's the key thing that you want to be concerned about. Now, you know, what would you do then in order to, you know, I mean, right? I mean, the social planner, if you can't avoid this distinction between infected and susceptible people, wants to have a steeper consumption decline than people would do on their own. I think that's the message of their paper. But in our paper, right, you can tell a more Panglossian version of all this, right? Because our social planner knows who's infected and who isn't. And in that case, you know, you don't want that. You want to tax consumption of infected people heavily. If you could do that, right? You would tell people, if you go out there and consume, we slap a huge tax on you. I mean, that, you know, how would you do this in practice? I mean, I don't know. That would be hard to do. But you want to forbid people essentially to consume, right? Or you would only give them very little. You would quarantine them. You would make sure that they stay away from susceptible people as much as possible. You deliver consumption to them to the degree that you must, because you also care about them, right? I mean, you want them to, obviously you want them to survive, but you also don't want them to infect susceptible people. So our social planner here can go much further, and once you do that, right, once you're able to quarantine infected, then, you know, there's probably little reason to tell the susceptible people to reduce their consumption. You know, in that case, you know, the economy's fine. As you see here, the green line, this is the social planner. No decline in output, no decline in labor, and all the harm gets avoided. There are more questions of what you do with the firms that are closing, and other firms that are opening up, and you know, I mean, that would be an interesting thing to do. If you think about the sectoral shift here, I think Sais and Zuckman have argued that maybe the government should step in as a consumer of last resort, right, and essentially pay workers in the sectors that are no longer in demand, right? So if you look at the displaced restaurant workers, displaced airline workers, maybe just keep them in the companies and keep paying them. The government just pretends essentially to buy these airlines, pretends to buy these restaurant meals, and pays for it by raising debt. The flights never happen, the restaurant meals never happen, but the workers still get paid. That could mitigate the decline in these industries, but it also, you know, lessens this possibility of the sectorial substitution. So that's the trade-off, I think, that we need to talk about. Do we need to really, how much of the sectorial substitution can happen? To the degree that it can happen, I think it's a good thing. To the degree that workers can't substitute to other sectors, you know, then maybe this idea of Sais and Zuckman is a good idea. But that goes beyond the model here, and it's an interesting debate. I'm kind of speculating here from the top of my head. You know, I think I'm going way beyond what the modelists say on that.
So I'm going to ask Mr. Lehrman to read the questions. We have a lot of people have voted on the questions, and so for the recording, it'll be good if one person reads it.
Should I take a few, or how do we do this?
I mean, they're already on the Q&A tool. So we start with the highest, I would say.
Okay.
You know, can you see it yourself?
It pops in and out. So I don't know.
So Dirk has a question.
Well, Dirk basically said, put a link where the paper can be found.
No, it's below that. He says on redistribution. It's it's earlier. It depends on how costly redistribution is, and can you see that, Harald?
Yeah. So it depends on how costly redistribution is. So here's another paper. So Dirk is twice as productive. He already has 2 papers on all of this. So here's a paper with Glover and Rios-Roll and Heathcote. And so there they make the assumption that there are no sectoral reallocation at all. So it's a question, right? So here reallocation is easy in our model. In other models, in their models, I guess it's impossible. So then, you know, so that would be another crucial parameter, I guess, in there. So I think, I see this also. Gabriel asked this question about, if there's some search and matching, maybe wanting to let it rip. I mean, search and matching models are great. I mean, this is all, sort of a simple environment. I think it would be enough to put some friction that it's not that easy to shift people from one sector to the other. And then of course, then the effects are not quite as strong, right? I mean, it's how shall I put it, right? Anything that mitigates the forces that we try to point at here will lead to less of a difference, right? And that's kind of obvious. And the question is, can one say something deeper than that? And right.
There was another question on the top. Is the basic SIR model not very old? Has the epidemiological modeling literature evolved since then? If so, what are the drawbacks of incorporating successor models?
Totally love that question. I mean, the SIR model, I mean, we all use it now. It is 100 years old. Somewhere there, I think it is. It is in many ways pretty silly. I mean, that would be another seminar, maybe for another day. I'm not sure that the epidemiologists work with something much more sophisticated. And if the epidemiologist listening to this, or if somebody knows a high-ranking epidemiologist who can tell me that, I would love to hear it. I mean, the epidemiologist publishes R number all the time, right? You hear about the replication number. Replication number R, in some ways, only makes sense in this very basic SIR model. Now, I know some colleagues have been working on more sophisticated versions of these models where some people know that they're infected, others don't, and where there's, all kinds of transition possibilities. And so you can jazz it up. There are some, I have some other ideas that I want to talk about here. There are some clear deficiencies of this model. But anyways, it's the model that I think even respected epidemiologists, by and large, use to advise the public. So you're using it here. Somebody tells me, no, the current state of the art for epidemiologists is, another model. Apt to use that. Would be lovely if somebody has that information. I'd love to hear about it. But it's I keep on trying to find it. I don't think it is.
Robert Hodrig asks, isn't it important to recognize that deaths are higher when people overwhelm the healthcare sector? Eichenbaum, Rebello, Trabant modeled this with a quadratic term.
Yeah, no, I mean that's a fair point. I mean, it turns out that this overwhelming of the healthcare sector that we were all very afraid of hasn't quite happened. So that's maybe part of the answer. The other answer is that, yes, if you put in this quadratic term in there, the quadratic term kicks in. If there are too many people that arrive, that too many infected, you get even more of a difference, right, compared to the Eichenbaum, Rebello, and Trabant situation, because with our sectorial differentiation, we don't get that many infected, and so therefore we are further away from overwhelming the healthcare sector, right? So we could put it in there, right? So it's an additional point, right? Anything that flattens the curve, as we do here, and the sectoral substitution flattens that curve, if you like, helps in avoiding this overwhelming of the healthcare sector. So I agree, it's an important point, and I think ERT did a great job in putting that in there, and other people do that too. It's kind of clear in which direction this goes, and since the model, I'd be a little hesitant to overemphasize the quantitative aspects. Maybe the direction is the more important to think about.
There's a question somewhat related. You talk about Sweden, but what about Italy or other countries? It doesn't seem that they were doing well without implementing threats. By Richard Uhlig.
No, I mean it's a fair question. I mean, at the New York Times this morning published, a wonderful article. I always marvel at the New York Times journalists how they come up with all these facts and so forth. I actually look at them for empirical evidence, as I did for this talk. So read that. It's interesting to see, how countries differ and why they differ. And we are still at a puzzle. We don't quite know why some countries do so well and other countries do so badly. Of course, the countries that do well, they pound their chest and say, I know some friends from Germany who say, oh, the Americans do it all wrong and the Germans do it all right. And look, maybe not. It's hard to say. I think the one thing about Italy, though, is that when it all started in Italy, and certainly myself, people didn't understand how bad this is going to be in a developed country. Right? We looked at China and said, yeah, things are bad in China. China, you know, I mean, who cares about the healthcare system in China? But seeing this happen in Italy, in an advanced economy, in a modern Western European country, and seeing so many people dead, I think that was a wake-up call, certainly for me, for my own behavior, right? And for many others who said, holy cow, if this happens in Italy like that, you know, it could happen at home. And I think people in Italy didn't, you know, they didn't know how bad this was going to become. If you opened up Italy now, that would be a different matter. I think people would be a lot more careful than they were back then. And so that's the message.
I'm just going down the number of votes here. There was a question. I don't see anything about government sector and financial sector in the model. What are possible consequences on the government sector, the impact on fiscal sector and debt, as many countries around the world face more spending to stem the rising infection?
You know, I mean, again, you know, this goes way beyond the analysis of the model, and maybe other people can speak to that. I still think this idea of you know, that Zeiss and Zuckman mentioned of the government as consumer of last resort is interesting, right? So I don't go to the movies, right? So the government instead could pay the movie theater, right? And how does the government pay for the movie theater? By eventually taxing me. So if you think of a recording equivalent world, I can raise debt now and tax me in the future. Or if in a recording equivalent world, they can tax me now. So the government come to me and say to me, Harold, normally you would go to the movie theaters, give us the money that you would normally spend the movie theaters, and we give it to the movie theater anyways. You don't get the movie consumption, but we give the movie theater the money, and that's one way of thinking about it. So I could save now all the money that I don't spend on movie theaters, on travel, and all these kinds of things, and I will then have to pay the government for the debt that it's raising in the future in order to keep up these sectors, and that's kind of what we're seeing, and we're spending the same, we just don't get the consumption goods. Maybe that's one way of thinking about it, and so I think it's okay. I think I don't know. What do you do if you're in a deep crisis and you know, government needs to do something? I wish they had better task forces, you know, where they would interact with economists thinking hard about these issues. I mean, much of that seems to be very ad hoc. And I know the focus and the Sachverständigenrat, he's doing an awesome job in Germany in informing the government, but governments could listen to us a lot more, I feel. But in principle, that is fine. You know, what can you do?
Maybe the next question by Professor Gubitz is related. How should we evaluate the public transfers to short-time workers in Germany, and also announced, or where we're putting together money in Europe to create that short-time worker
so that's
system?
Right. I mean, so that's an interesting difference between, say, Germany and the United States. And again, it sort of comes back to this Zeiss-Zuckman idea, which I keep on mentioning, of government as a consumer of last resort, right? So the government paying the movie theater, ultimately, you could argue, is really all about paying the workers, right? And so the government pays the movie theater to pay the workers, right? And so one way of thinking about this is the government is simply subsidizing the movie theater to keep the workers on its payroll by paying them, and that keeps workers employed. So that's you know, they're getting the money, and it's financed by taxing me or by making me pay for movie theater consumption that I'm not getting. So it can alleviate employment decline, and it can, and so Werning and Lorenzoni and Guerri have a nice model on this, right? And it can alleviate some of the consumption externalities that come from that. So that's a good thing. But there is a drawback to that, and you know, I should mention this, right? I mean, the you don't want to, at this point, you don't want to keep all the restaurant workers in restaurants. You don't want to keep all this, you know, airline people working in airlines, because we need people, you know, at Amazon. We need people in lots of other sectors that are rising. We need tracers. We need, you know, need all kinds of people in other sectors. Maybe not as much as in the sectors that are declining. That's true, but we have to do a careful trade-off here in not freezing the labor market too much, right? It's true that labor has to decline in some sectors, but we have to try to, you know, I would argue that we need to shift a good part of the labor force as quickly as possible into the labor sectors that are needed.
Thank you. The next question is related to that, right? What about capital? What if the low infectious sector can't expand quick enough because of delays in building capital to expand, frictions? Then we have quick job loss in the high infectious sector and not enough new jobs fast enough in the low infectious sector, by Christoph Demet. Before you answer it, let me also throw in John Taylor. You said you have to leave. Do you want to throw in something, another question to Harald?
I just want to, I do have to leave, but Harold, thank you so much. This is terrific.
Thanks, John.
And there's many more questions, so you can read those later, but thanks so much. And thank you, Volker.
Thank you, John. So Harald, if you still have a little bit of time, we can still.
Yeah, I have time. I don't want to sort of bore people to death here. So yeah.
No, but I think we have 2, 3 questions here, which may be still worth answering, and we can go a few minutes over time. So what about the capital question? I think the next question by Gabriel Fagan, your model incorporates a frictionless labor market. If you were to modify this by adding search and matching, would you still say let's rip? That's maybe already been answered with Dirk Krueger's comment, but what about the other question?
Yeah, I mean, so again, you know, I think I mentioned this in context to Dirk, and also I think Gabriel, I mentioned this question too, and likewise Christoph's question. I mean, it's so thank you for all these questions, by the way. You know, obviously anything that throws sands into this picture here, right, is going to lead to more of a consumption decline, less of a sectorial shift. I mean, no doubt, right? And so we can think of all these forces. So I think what all these questions highlight is that, you know, the model is I mean, it's simple, right? It's simple. It's highlighting a particular force, right? And then we can think of additional elements, and we know, right? And we don't need to maybe write on a full model. We know how they will mitigate or enhance these movements, right? And so anything that will mitigate this sectorial shift will mitigate, you know, our wondrous, you know, substitution effect for sure, right? And if you need capital to build up, you know, that takes time. You know, that makes it harder if there's search and matching, if there's you know, job specific skills, you know, that makes it hard. Then again, I think it's in many sectors, maybe it's not that super hard. I don't know. I mean, you know, if you think of Amazon, you know, they seem to get their supply from essentially the same firms that Macy's gets its supply from, right? And then they need to put these packages together. Maybe they need to expand production possibilities there. I don't know. And then they need to put them on trucks and planes. But you know, the trucks and planes that flew passengers before can now fly Amazon packages. So maybe the capital can also be reallocated to some degree. I don't, you know, it's a question, right? If you can reallocate the capital just as much as labor, then this picture is correct. If you can't reallocate capital or you can't reallocate labor, then this picture gets mitigated a lot.
So maybe let me mention quickly these 2 comments by Dirk Krueger. He said that it's crucial that individuals understand the probability of infection. One can debate the assumption of rational expectations. Qualitatively, the mitigation mechanism works as long as individuals understand the link between economic behavior and infection probabilities somewhat, but quantitatively, misperceptions affect the strength of the mechanism. So for curbing the epidemic, the more paranoid individuals are, the better. And,
no, absolutely. And let me just add to that, this cuts both ways, right? I mean, could also argue that maybe in some places people have become too panicky to get infected, right? And you're seeing this partly in this, you know, I mean, how dangerous is it really? How dangerous is it that you can get infected? And maybe there's even more shift, more holding back than would be rational. So it could also be that people did ignore it, right? And I mean, you know, that's an interesting question to ask.
And Dirk added on the outdatedness of SIR, in some way, all the economic extensions say that one cannot take the parameters of the SIR as constant, but rather as responding to behavior. I doubt that epidemiologists would question that. It seems important in the I group to distinguish between the asymptomatic and those with symptoms, and perhaps even distinguish the severely sick. Clover et al. Tried to do this with a safer extension of the SIR. So we have more questions. What about the individual perception of probability of getting infected? Is that included? Can that be included, for example, to model for different behavioral and social patterns?
Yeah, I mean, it is already, I mean, in some ways, you know, what we're doing compared to the SIR model, and I think you hinted at that, is that we make the infection rate endogenous, right? So for
Exactly.
epidemiologists, Tau-T is just a parameter, or maybe can be mitigated by government-induced social distancing. But here it's a choice, right? And that's where economists can come in and sort of understand choices. And that's something where epidemiologists have, you know, I don't think they think about this at all. I think economists really have a comparative advantage. So it's already an extension of the SIR model in that sense. And that's something where economists can contribute. And sure, this differs across populations. I think that may be what this question hinted at, right? I mean, it's likely that young people, you know, that say, I don't get infected, you know, if I get infected, it doesn't matter, you know, or the Brazilian president was said, I'm a sportsman, you know, it doesn't matter to me, you know, okay, so they go out and for them, Tau-T is small, presumably, or maybe they don't, you know, there's no disutility in our model of being infected. Maybe you could put that in there too, right? And maybe these guys don't die at the same rate, or it doesn't affect them as much. And so that will mitigate, right? If the disutility of being infected, which is crucially in this model, is different across different people, and people choose different consumption patterns. And that would be an interesting extension for sure, of this analysis.
Dirk also says transmission inside the family is interesting. In reduced form, it would lead to workers caring more about staying healthy, making the results even starker. Private incentives for substitution get even stronger, and the impact on curbing the pandemic even more powerful. And here's a question, Paul Welfens. Social planner implicitly is betting on a vaccination. There is a substitution paradox in your model. If more people switch into low infection risk consumption varieties, the prospects to achieve herd immunity soon is diminished. This implicit perspective should be addressed before the model starts. Obviously, the social planner would not want to tax as you have proposed if this is a Swedish social planner who implicitly bets on achieving herd immunity.
Yeah, there's an, and now we're getting into I mean, this whole issue of herd immunity. I mean, it's, you know, true. I mean, in some ways here, we also cut this off at 150 weeks because we figure by that time, you know, hopefully we're having sufficient testing or you know, or cures, right? That the problem goes away. But but literally, we don't have that in the model, right? This whole issue of herd immunity, so that will be maybe a topic for another day. What is true is that if the replication number is different, then the number of total deceased eventually, the asymptotic limit of that is different. I actually had tweeted a picture of that a while ago, so I'm happy to interact with people on that one. So it's true, the curve, so the curve gets flattened, but also the integral over the curve of or the limit of the deceased also differs. And that's something that is often ignored even by epidemiologists. They always said herd immunity is by 60% infected. Not true. It's not. It's just a wrong statement about the SIR model. I don't know why they keep on quoting that.
Here's a question. It would be interesting to see the sensitivity of results to various policies implemented in the US and other countries. That's going beyond. I mean, you already mentioned a number of issues there. Here's also the question, do the results or are the results sensitive to the degree of openness? Shouldn't we include the trade section in the model? Maybe that'd be an interesting extension with a two-country model and trade. Yeah, so I mean, these are, I mean, there are lots of great questions that arise, and I think a really interesting debate. You're already building on Eigenbaum, Riello, Trabant, so you know, I mean, this is not super hard to do. So I hope that some of these questions induce people to, you know, do their own follow-up work here and probe, and you know, these are important issues. I don't want to, you know, I mean, this is by no means conclusive what I have here. I thought this comment by Dirk is also interesting. One way to interpret our results is that government action was important on informing and coordinating people's beliefs about infection probabilities and differences in these probabilities across sectors. It's a good point. It's a good point. I mean, you know, maybe, I don't know, is that the difference between Germany and the United States? Merkel goes out and says we're going to have, I don't know, whatever, 200,000 dead people very soon, be careful.
You know, I mean, if you don't panic at that point, you know, I don't know what's wrong with you, right? Whereas Donald Trump initially might have downplayed the risk, and maybe people went out more and you know, didn't worry. I mean, is that possible? I don't know. Some people might argue that. I don't want to take a political stance here. That's not my aim. I'm just saying that depending on how you inform the public and how salient the infection probabilities is, you behave differently, right? That's a psychological aspect, and here we just assume rationality. That's an interesting issue. You know.
I mean, maybe to throw in one comment, we're just trying to get out of the lockdown, and we're actually finding it pretty difficult because now there are many different voices, and some very cautious, some saying, so there's still fear. So I think in terms of the exit or the exit from the lockdown, this kind of government communication might be very helpful, right? So,
yeah,
but anyway,
exactly.
it's outside the model a little bit.
No, it's absolutely true. And I think even so, if this is a model of the exit of the lockdown, that's sort of one way of thinking about this paper, then we shouldn't say we should return back to normal, right? While the infection is still, you know, milling about, we still need the sectoral shift. And I think that's, you know, we still need to, the economy is not going to be the same. Can maybe rely on people to do, you know, to do things on their own. Maybe that suffices, but we'll still see not as many people going to restaurants and going on flights, taking vacations, and congregating as we did before. It's just, and that's maybe a good thing, right? We should be cognizant of that.
Okay, there's still a few questions, but we're also quite far beyond our time. It's up to you, Harald.
I'm happy to answer more. I'm here, so I'm not. You know,
okay.
I'm in a lockdown. I can't go anywhere. So.
Thanks a lot for the. It seems like the results are very sensitive to the choice of parameters. I guess the answer is yes.
Yes, absolutely.
What about exposure level for agents? Would be a better option to use exposure instead of a standalone susceptibility to being infected?
Degree of exposure. So I don't know whether the person can clarify.
I guess
that.
there's an SIR and SEIR model. Maybe that's referring to the extension there.
Yeah, so I mean, there's sort of a CF acronyms now. I'm trying to remember what the E stood for.
Yeah, exposed.
Exposed. I think the exposed are people that are, right. So if I remember, so was that, so who uses maybe even Dirk or others? I think exposed are people that are infected but don't show symptoms. Isn't that right? So you're getting, so exposed as you can transmit the disease already, but you don't know that you're infected, and the infected are these the people that know that they're infected. So that's a distinction here, right? And that would be interesting to consider. I think another version of this model that some colleagues here have proposed is that we do essentially an SER model, right? People never know that they're infected until they either recover or die. And so then the infected would behave exactly like the susceptible people, and then their consumption patterns would be the same. That would alter some of the conclusions, right? The infected people would then also crowd more into the low infection sectors because, you know, they think they're susceptible. So that's, you know, and in some ways that actually makes matters worse, right? If the infected behave like the susceptible, you know, that's that can be good news to some degree because they're consuming less, but it's also bad news here to some degree because they're crowding these bad infecting in these low infection sectors, and how that would play out in total, I don't know. We haven't done that calculation. And so then you could have a range between the SER model, SIR model. You could have some, you know, probabilistic shift from E to R.
I mean, there's a long question. I'm going to summarize it a little bit. It's really aiming at distinguishing the financial sector and the real sector. And the person asking the question is wondering whether the real sector is not very strongly affected, while actually the financial sector is being protected and will survive that very well. He says, please remember that during the last crisis, the QE policy exerted very positive impact on stock exchanges. So maybe this time will be similar. Due to such tools and regulations, the financial sector is quite immune, whereas the real economy is much more affected. That's going beyond the paper, but maybe you have some insights or some points you want to share
Yeah, I
on,
mean, it's
maybe also in terms of
yeah.
how to extend the analysis. What about including a financial sector?
Yeah, I mean, it's I mean, this opens a whole Pandora's box of questions, and again, as you point out, goes way beyond here. I think one thing that could potentially be interesting to think about, that would be a fairly small extension, is to you know, assume that when workers work, part of their labor earnings goes into some, you know, somebody holding stocks, right? So imagine people don't only hold labor; they also hold stocks, right? I mean, the labor earnings would be the same as their stock dividends, then, right? So wages would be stock dividends. And then you could calculate the net present value. And so you could calculate the net present value of the labor dynamics, of the wage dynamics effectively, and calculate what the stock market would do and compare that, right? And think about this and how steep would the stock market decline. I think that might be an interesting starting point. But the question, I think, goes way beyond that, right? And in the sense that it's, you know, are banks, you know, are they going to be rescued, right? It's clear that small companies that have loans from banks maybe not be able to repay them. That should get banks in trouble. Once the banks are in trouble, depositors are in trouble. That could get even more trouble. So governments typically step up to the plate and rescue financial sectors at that point. So I don't know. It's a good question. I mean, it's clear that lots of, I mean, we know that universities have been holding back. So clearly their endowment funds lost a lot. So that's a hit on the financial side. So the financial side has been hit. Retail banking is probably going to be kept safe simply in order to keep the depositors safe some way, one way or the other. And whether it's done, we are, the government has all kinds of tools of doing that. You know, I mean, the financial sector is really, really interesting, and I have lots and lots of thoughts on that. And that, you know, let me just throw in one more thing, perhaps, right? I mean, so much is made out of trying to keep companies alive, afloat, but maybe we want to think also about how bad would it be if we just shift ultimately ownership of these companies, right? If they go bankrupt, but then somebody else takes over the exact same company and starts running them again. How bad would that be? From the economic perspective, maybe not that much. Is that something that we want to think about? Maybe.
Thank you. So there's some other brief questions. What about variations in quarantines? And what about spillovers in the family unit to capture the idea that one would limit risky consumption to protect family members? So the first one was variations in current quarantine.
Yeah. So the quarantine, I mean, I don't know whether that refers to the lockdowns. And we haven't considered lockdowns here really, right? I mean, having the social planner solution, which who knows who the infected are and he kind of quarantines infected. I mean, that's one way of thinking about it. It's not quite that, but it's effectively a version of what the social planner here does. And if the social planner knows who the infected are, it can just quarantine and say, you know, you stay behind, you know, you stay in this glass room, right? And nobody touches you, and we put food under the lid so that you can't infect anybody else. And that would be, you know, maybe that's the best thing to do. And families, you know, sometimes have to deal with that, right? You might have somebody who's infected at home. You know, I mean, the whole family issue, I think, is a fascinating one. Seeing this issue arising a lot with health workers, for example. You know, do people make different consumption choices if the family structure is different? Is an interesting question. We know that in Italy, perhaps many old people lived at home, and that's maybe what created much of the disaster in Bergamo. So I you know, interesting issue. I don't have anything to say on that.
Okay. There's a question, what happened to the trade-off between curve reversal and flattening the curve if the elasticity of substitution is calibrated to half rather than lower or higher value?
If the, can you repeat that question, curve?
Curve reversal and flattening the curve. We can also take another one.
No, I mean, when something, so this is here, I mean, this is sort of this is here a distinction between flattening and reversal, right? But that was for a different parameter variation, maybe not the one that the person that asked the question had in mind, right? And so here's our baseline result. We already saw that we get flattening of the curve. Let me just maybe first go here. We saw that we get a flattening of the curve here compared to the homogeneous sector economy, right? So our curve is considerably flattened, and that's because the infection risk is lower, right? So that's a flattening that's already happening here. And then it doesn't take much to get the reversal, that is to get not just a flattening, but to get the infection rate always declining. And here's sort of one parameter variation that does that. If you lower this pi s parameter to 80%, 87% of its originally calibrated value, right? Before we had infections going up and then going down. If you go down to 87% of our original pi s, then we're getting the infected only going down. So that's a situation where the R is strictly smaller than 1 now. That's always this nirvana that they're looking for, that the replication rate is below 1 and that the number of infected declines over time and the disease dynamics eventually stops on its own. And we can also get that if the elastic substitution is very high, right? And so I think that's, let's see, there was one picture here, right? So here it also showed that, right? So that's our baseline scenario. In fact, go up and go down. But of course, the elasticity of substitution is very high, you know, then at least for the chosen phi's, you know, everybody's just consuming pizza at home. Nobody goes to restaurants anymore. And that is, you know, and that's also true for any other sector. And that will also lead to this R smaller than 1, the infection dynamic stopping on its own. Now, because we started from some people that are already infected initially, right? You know, I mean, you can't avoid, you know, this disease, you know, rising over time, but obviously much lower value. So I don't know. I mean, much is often made from this R bigger than 1, R smaller than 1. I mean, that's another sort of one of the maybe somewhat misguided debates in the SIR discussion, but we can talk about that at great lengths. I mean, I'm not sure that.
Well, Harald, millions are sitting in front of their TV and monitoring R going up and down, and it's affecting our lives.
Absolutely.
It's amazing. It's amazing.
It's amazing. That's right. And and you know, having R equal to 1.1. I mean, it's true. Then when you see this here, right, the infected go up, but then eventually they go down because eventually, you know, more and more people get infected. So it has to go down eventually. And you know, it's better if it goes down earlier. And so in that sense, it's good to watch for sure. But you know, there's a difference between having R equals 3 and R equals 1.2. But 1.2 eventually becomes below 1, and it's just a question of time. And you see this here also, right? The infection dynamic eventually here, you know, at that point, even the blue line here starts to turn around, right? And that's a typical feature for all these SRR models. And that's where R is smaller than 1. So it's true that R is smaller than 1 is the holy grail. I understand that eventually you want the number of infected going down. But if you have a high number of infected and the number of infected go down, you still have the death rates rising. So I mean, it's only partial victory, that's for sure. It's not the end. It's just a turnaround in infected numbers.
Okay, I just made the attempt as co-host if I could promote Dirk Krueger, because I found him among the listeners and I wanted to promote him to join the discussion, but maybe somehow I kicked him accidentally out. So next time you talk to him, please apologize for me, because I had the thought that he could both talk about his last comment. And there was a question about where can I find Glover's paper, which is also something Dirk mentioned. So I wanted to bring him in, but unfortunately he hasn't. That hasn't quite worked out. Next time we have to do it ahead of time.
Yeah.
So
it's possible that it's. I mean, I partly suspect their paper has also appeared in the CEPR COVID papers, right? So if one goes to the CEPR website, they have a COVID-19 series in which they publish, you know, papers that they quickly vetted. Our papers there, I think, in issue number 5. And if I remember correctly, their papers also in that series. But so if you just look through that, I'm almost positive that it's there. But if not, write to me or write to Dirk Krueger. I'm sure Dirk is more than happy to send you that.
Okay, and we can. There was also a question about a reference for the paper with government as spender of last resort, and I think that can also be found in the paper when you download it.
Yeah, it's probably. I'm not sure that we cite it, and I mean, it may be more of an op-ed that I mean, I have to actually trace that one down. I mean,
Okay.
it's sort of one of the things that floats about, and but I have to trace down the exact source. It's Zeiss Zuckman, so.
Oh, that was the paper. Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I think we're through with the questions. Thank you for attending. And I want to, before you all leave, we still have a huge group listening in. Before you all leave, I just want to thank Harald for the excellent presentation. I also want to announce that on Wednesday, we have the presentation by Matthias Trabant, so that's closely related. Probably he will also be talking about his new paper, so I'll talk to him about that. And then next week we have Daniel Gross, who will have another model, doing the best they can in a team of a cross-interdisciplinary team in doing a model trying to predict where this goes with the epidemic. And then after him on Wednesday next week, we have Werner Röger. I think this will be very interesting. He is running the model section at the European Union, at Brussels, at the Commission. And they have been running quite a bit of simulations. They actually did a paper way before this crisis, many years ago, on the impact of a pandemic or of an epidemic. And so I've been active in this. So I'm looking forward to seeing many of you then. Thank you, and have a good evening if you're in Europe, or a good day if you're in the US or elsewhere. And thank you, Harald, again. Goodbye to
Thank you,
everyone.
Volker. Thank you so much for all the questions. Thank you to all who listened.